Hello, everyone. This is the second presentation of three presentations prepared for the Florida Department of Transportation. This presentation is on visual assessment of tree and palm condition. It's something that we feel could be very helpful for the department as they try to inspect their landscapes that are already established and make sure that they're performing to the standards that they want. We use these techniques that were adapted by Jerry Bond. We use these in our own research on tree condition and health and survival, and found them to be pretty useful and quick to do. So, without further ado, we will present this, including a special section on palm condition, which came at the request of John Heller, because at the moment they were actually assessing trees using the Florida grades and standards, which is a bit cumbersome and not quite suited for field assessment. So here we go. Visual assessment of tree and palm condition. So we're going to start with a few definitions about what condition is and how it relates to other aspects of tree status. So a tree's health is its ability to function biologically as it resists pests, diseases, poor sight conditions, and mistreatment. Sometimes people call this vitality. It's just how much life, how healthy a tree is, and able to overcome stresses that will attempt to bring on that tree and undermine it. So contrast that with its structural function, and you can see that it's a little bit different. So tree risk is related to structural function in that it's the likelihood a tree will cause harm given the presence of nearby targets. These are people, vehicles, structures, and utilities, and it factors in both the structural integrity of the tree and the likelihood of something being injured. What's the likely outcome should a tree or tree part fail and strike a target? In this picture, this is a palm that fell actually outside my condo, and it had a very compromised trunk, but the way it was looking like it was going to fall, not a lot of traffic because it's not going towards any roadway or any kind of walkway. So that's, the risk is more than just will the tree fail, it's will it fail and actually harm something. So tree condition is the combined state of both the health and the structural integrity, which is a component of tree risk. So it's factoring in both how strong the tree is and how healthy the tree is. Not all healthy trees are safe. This is a picture of a water oak that I found. You can see that it's completely hollow. A big section of it has broken out, but on the same note, it's very green. It has a very dense canopy, and it is doing just fine. When you think of a tree, there's a big core of wood in the trunk and the main limbs, and only a small fraction of that wood is actually living as the tree ages. The inside of the tree's trunk and branches eventually dies off and becomes non-functioning sapwood, and eventually, on some species, that will even become like a chemically infused heartwood, which is a decay-resistant core of a tree. So not all healthy trees are safe. I've seen trees that are just completely hollow, just the shell, maybe an inch or two of of solid trunk, and they're still green and vibrant because they have enough conducting sapwood and enough phloem and everything to keep them alive, even though they could blow over in a normal windstorm. Unhealthy trees will become unsafe. So a tree needs to be healthy to maintain its growth, and its wood. There are living conduits that kind of bring food and photosynthesis to the center of the trunk, and to areas of the sapwood that are still functioning. That's really kind of vital in compartmentalization, and just growth in general. Trees, when they have a weakness, like they have a cavity or some decay, they put on extra growth in response to that, in response to the motion that is caused by that defect, and they actually will try to outgrow a weakness and strengthen themselves. Well, if a tree is unhealthy, it's declining, it has a sparse canopy, it can't do that. It can't maintain what it already has, and it can't put on new growth in response to defects and weaknesses. What's the important? So there's a lot of reasons for assessing tree condition, and one of the things is that trees don't just often die overnight. Sometimes you hear that as a claim, but the reality is trees often need a lot of things to happen. They're really resilient. They can't run away from a threat, so they bulk up. They have storage for the week for the lean times in their wood and in their branches. They produce an excess of food in most cases to kind of get them through the long haul. And it takes a lot of things working against a tree to eventually undo all that and to kill it, especially once they're mature. So, here's an example of what we call like a mortality spiral, where you show a healthy tree and all the things, like being in a limited planting site, growing beyond the space that's available, having insects kind of finally attack them as they're weakened, and then having someone come in and say, no, this thing is not going to recover. All these things kind of had to come into play before that tree eventually was dead or removed. But at each stage, there's opportunities for the tree to get out of it. So if we know the condition and we know where a tree is now, we can see where it's headed if it keeps going down the same path, or we can do some sort of mitigation. We can add some care and get it out of that death spiral and get it back. Things don't move quickly, but if we let things go too far, there's just no chance that you can bring a tree back, So, tree condition actually is a very common thing. It's one of the most common factors in inventory. I think I read that's even more common than diameter, which surprised me. But it allows you to determine present maintenance requirements for a site and determine the future requirements as well. It also is a key determinant when preserving trees around development. So if you're working around sites, like redeveloping, say, a wayside or an interchange, knowing the condition of a tree can really help you make sure you protect the right trees. If you have some really big grand oaks that you want to save, but they're already on their way out, your efforts are probably better spent on a healthier medium-sized tree somewhere else, and kind of change the footing of your development in response to that. Tree conditions also really important in models that assess ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are things like the shading effect and cooling effect on houses and people. Their carbon sequestration, stormwater mitigation, all these things that have a value that we've kind of used to justify budgets for urban forestry and urban planting efforts. These depend on the condition of the tree. So a tree that has a big, leafy, healthy crown is going to produce more than a tree that has the exact same diameter at the stem, but is dying back and on its way out. So conditions also very important for assessing risk and appraisal. So risk, like I said before, factors in condition, and again, a tree that's has defects that weaken its trunk, and then has a health that's diminished, so the tree can't outgrow those defects, will have a higher likelihood of failure and will have a higher risk rating than a tree that's the opposite of that. Similarly, say someone damages a tree on your property or removes it or does something and you want to go after them, there are ways to appraise the value of the tree that you've lost, even if it's beyond something that's available at the nursery. But these, some of the formulas that go into plant appraisal factor in condition. So condition is good to know for that reason as well. And again, as I said before, trees don't do things quickly. So if you know the condition of a tree now, that's a good predictor of what the condition is going to be like in the future. A tree that's on its way out will only probably get diminished further as the years go on. Assessing tree condition. So there's several methods that are given. You can choose those based on the age of the tree. Nursery stock versus mature specimens. So like nursery stock, anything that you can buy in a wholesale nursery setting, that gets assessed through the Florida Grades and Standards, which was recently updated in 2015. And a lot of effort went into that. Florida's really, I think it's the only state that has their own standards, and they're well above and beyond the national standards, which I think I'll show you in the next couple pages. If it's a mature specimen, we referred to a really solid book by Jerry Bond, a consultant out of New York. It's published in self-published, but available through the International Society of Arboriculture. And it's a guide called Urban Tree Health. Finally, things, the factors that you use to assess a tree for condition differ by the tree, whether it's broadleaved or conifer or palm. And it also depends on what your actual objective is. And, things like, say, nutrient deficiencies. If you want to do a fertilizer program, the color of the foliage would be the one factor that really kind of plays into that. And actually, there's meters that will read that for you if you don't want to eyeball it yourself. So we'll start where it all begins, which is the nursery, and talk about assessing nursery stock condition. Like I said before, Florida has its own grades and standards that are specific to the state. They go far beyond what the ANSI's, the American National Standards Institute, Z60 standards are, which are published by American Hort. These standards, the national standards, are largely just some guidelines based on like ball size versus trunk diameter and some really kind of coarse minimals that could be agreed upon at a national level. When you have fewer people kind of contributing to a standards, when you go to a local regional level like Florida, you can get a lot more detail and people to agree on a lot more things that are beyond just the minimum. And that's what happened with the Florida grades and standards. Whichever one you use, or if you're using them both, what a standards does is it provides a very common language for specifying nursery stock in this case. It's just the definitions and kind of the parameters. You put those together in your work orders and your specifications to get the tree that you want, and we'll show you that the Florida grades and standards, it's really like a grade of fruit or vegetable. Like, do you want to grade a apple or do you want to grade a tomato? We have that for our palms and for our broadleaf trees. So, as I said before, there's specific guidelines for the type of tree. So, an X-current tree is one that's kind of like the picture above to the right, where it's very up and down. Typically, these are conifers, but there are some cultivars of broadleaf trees like oaks that have that very up and down pattern. So, there's guidelines for those. There's guidelines for more spreading or decurrent trees. Some trees are most common as a multi-stem variety, whether they're planted together or they just naturally fork. So there's standards for those. And then palms are their own separate beast in these grades and standards. I said before that the grades are kind of similar to what you'd see with produce. You can get fancy grade. Sorry, I was interrupted by a lawnmower going by. You can get fancy grade trees, which are something that you'd probably want in like the front end of a development or a really high impact area. Florida number ones and number twos, which are they have some notable defects that are still correctable that maybe would be more suitable for a park area or even an interchange or something like that. And then what they would consider cull, which is a tree that's not worth planting and not worth getting off the truck. So condition factors into these grades and standards. The first is structural integrity. So as you can see, the Florida fancy trees right there, they have one central leader, and they have smaller branches that are coming off of that main leader. It's not a bunch of equal-sized stems forking from one place. That's desirable for a lot of traits. That structure right there will help you with a lot of damage control. It's a very strong structure that prevents rain damage, ice damage, and wind damage, and we try to attain that when we grow trees from a small size to their eventual mature size. In contrast, you have a Florida number one where you have some competing limbs. In this case, you can see the picture of the left. These are what we call codominant stems, or stems that are about the same size, coming from the same point. And this is an actual weak attachment. Trees don't normally form these when they grow in a forest setting because all the competition forces them to go kind of up like a pole, But when we get certain species out into open light in a park-like setting, their branches start going like crazy, competing against each other, and you can have multiple competing or codominant branches, which can set them up for failure in hurricanes and stuff. So we want to kind of work around that and avoid those, or you can actually prune one of those back and reduce it, and it becomes a Florida fancy just by doing that, So things to know. Also, the tree to the right of that, again, it has a central leader, but it doesn't have a nice branch spacing, So in addition to having codominant stems, having a bunch of branches that are kind of coming from the same part of the trunk is a weakness. So we try to establish good spacing between what we call our main scaffolded branches, which are the branches we're eventually going to retain on a tree when they're mature. Florida number 2, these have codominants just like the Florida number 1s, but they're a little bit worse. So you could have codominants that are just more than 2 stems coming from the upper half of the canopy. You can have just the bifurcation, the 2 forking codominant lower in the trunk, or you can have some sort of defect in the trunk that's a result of either propagation or dieback at the main leader. So the picture in the middle of the Florida number 2 is what we call dog leg. That could be a result of budding, putting a bud on the side of a rootstock and having it take off, and it just hasn't straightened out over time with taper growth. Or it could be that the main stem died back and a lateral took over, and that's what's left. So just not as desirable. I think that's more of an aesthetic thing in that case. But that's why it's a number 2. And then finally, the culls would be something that just doesn't have a main leader at all, or has multiple forking in the bottom half of the trunk, because it just takes way more to correct that than the other scenarios. In addition to what's in the canopy, tree condition and structural integrity, trees are downgraded in the grades and standards if they have unstable root balls, so they move around in the container, the trunk's kind of loose, and it kind of sways around. If the root balls are undersized, so that could be either that you get a balled and burlap tree and it was just dug too close to the trunk for the caliper that you got, or it was in a pot that's way too small, If a tree's over 2 inches in caliper and it's over-reliant on supports, that's a sign that you will have problems getting it to survive without a lot of staking in the landscape. And trees should be culled for deep plantings and a lot of circling roots. And there's some guidelines for that. Having a little bit of that's okay, but they have guidelines for how much circling root is too much, where you'd eventually cull it. So. Trees can also be downgraded for wounds on the trunk. Things more than 10% of the trunk circumference are probably something that'd be hard for it to overcome. And if it's more than 2 inches long, so if it goes all the way up and down the tree like a buck rub, or it just slid off the back of the trailer and scraped all the way down the trunk, that's going to be something that's very difficult for the tree to overcome. You want to look at the quality of the canopy. If more than 10% of the crown is necrotic, which means it's dead, chlorotic, which means it's yellow, or otherwise damaged by pests and disease, it'll be downgraded. And then, if it looks thin or sparsely foliated, you can see here these magnolias are really densely foliated. If you, by comparison, some of the trees that you see in the truck, have a lot more light shining through, that those trees should be downgraded. Keeping in mind that some trees, like live oak, they lose a lot of their leaves during the spring, or the early spring, winter area. So it could just be the time of year. And then also some trees, when they're harvested, kind of like the ficuses and stuff like that, once you start moving them around, they lose a lot of leaves, but they will grow back. So bear in mind that it could be species specific. So if you're concerned, talk to someone who knows a little bit better. So assessing tree condition for mature trees. So Those were the grades and standards. They're, again, meant to communicate with a common language what you want from a nursery and make sure that that's what you get and have something to say, hey, this is not what I wanted, If you have that common language, you can have those conversations and come to a resolution. Well, those are great, but they're kind of time-consuming, and they're not actually designed for assessing mature trees. If you're looking at trees, and especially you have thousands of trees that you're taking care of, which is more than you'll plant in any given year, there are quicker and easier ways of getting at some of the same information. One of the first things you can do is look at ratio or live crown ratio, which is the full version of this word, is the proportion of a tree's height that is occupied by live crown. So here is a tree, a live oak, in a shopping mall by my house. It was raised up a little too much for this clearance in the parking lot. And you can see here, there's a handy guide that comes with the book that I showed you before by Jerry Bond. I think everyone should have that. If you're doing this kind of work, is a little meter on the side that goes from 0 to 99 or 100. And what it does is you line it up with the tree visually. You can kind of put it forward and backwards, line it up with your eye, move forward or backward from the tree till you get to where the top meets the top of the tree and the bottom meets the bottom. And you can see here, if you go from 0 down to 40, this tree has a 40% live crown ratio. And you can check for comparison purposes. And I believe for ratio, I believe that the risk ratings for track say that anything less than 30% live crown ratio would predispose a tree to failure. So that'd be a good cutoff point, and it would be worth checking the track manual again for that. Here's another one. This is called Opacity. I kind of went over this when I was talking about drought stress. Opacity is the proportion of the upper crown of a tree where leaves block the view of light or the sky behind the tree. So you can see here there's a row of pines that are kind of by my center where I work. And if you can look here, one of these trees out of the 4 is not like the others. If you look at this tree, what is the opacity of this tree? And here's a cool little guide that Jerry Bond shows. And if you look here, it doesn't look like 90 to me. It doesn't look like 70. I mean, somewhere in the 50% range. So that would be rated a 3 in an opacity rating based on this scale. And that's helpful. You can see what's normal for your species and kind of compare against each other. And you can see that this is not normal based on what you saw with these other trees. And this tree is flagging, and it kind of gives you a way of kind of catching these early on. Vitality, by contrast, is the proportion of the crown that's free of young twig dieback. So you can't use this on palms, and you may not be able to use this on all conifers because they don't have woody twigs and foliage like you do on a broadleaf tree. But for broadleaf trees, you can use this to gauge health. So this is a winged elm, I believe, that was in a parking lot. And you can see here that I would say on this case, 80 to 100% of the limbs have some sort of dieback. We can see the woody twig sticking through beyond the foliage. This is a clear sign of drought stress in most species. And because of that, is a proportion of the crown that's free of twig dieback. So if you have 80 to 100% of the crown of dieback, you'd give it a 1 rating here because there's only a few branches that don't have that going on. This is really cool. People seem to really like this when I talk about this in the presentations. So this is growth. It's another measure that Bond uses in his book, and it's measuring the average shoot growth extension on a branch. If you look at the very end of the branch where there's like 2 leaves and a bud, this is the newest part of the branch, right? It's where the growth point of the limb is. And every year, growth kind of ends for the season and then starts up in the spring again. And you get these scars on a branch. They're called bud scars, right? and you can look at the distance between these and see how health is changing over time. So in this case, this is a tree that's been in my parking lot outside my work for about 10 years without being moved or kind of done anything. You can see that these increments are about the same, right? The growth has not slowed down between the increment on the left and the increment on the right. The one on the left is the older, this is like last year, and the one on the right is this year. So what that's showing you is that health is staying the same for this tree over time. If this tree was getting constricted because it was in a really small planting site, that second growth increment on the right might be a little shorter. Also, when you plant trees, you'll see how fast they were growing in the nursery. You'll be able to see that in the branch. And then you'll see this period where it's kind of declined because it's stressful when you transplant a tree. And then you can use it to see when the tree's recovered to like its pre-planting state, in the landscape. And that means that the tree's established. So it's pretty cool. It's kind of like a living log of the health of a tree over time. In addition to the other things, there's quality, which is the percentage of the upper crown that is free from necrotic, chlorotic, and undersized foliage. So we use the upper crown for both this and for the opacity because trees like pines, they tend to self-prune. Like the lower branches are it's not like these species aren't really shade tolerant, so their lower branches will eventually get shaded out by the upper branches. And it's just they're dying from competition with each other, So we look at the upper crown, and even when you do that in this case, you'll see that there is some chlorosis here, and you're looking at maybe like 40% chlorosis, So that would be another way to rate these trees. So, structural integrity is more related to risk, which is still important because you have trees along transportation corridors, some of the busiest in the state, and some of those are on boulevards in downtown settings that you're managing. So knowing the structural integrity or the risk associated with a tree is quite important. And if you're going to get into that, I would highly recommend that you look at the Tree Risk Assessment BMP, which is that purple book. And then if you have folks that are working with trees with you, have a few of them get the Tree Risk Assessment qualification from the International Society of Horticulture, because that is a really good program that will open their eyes to what they need to be looking at when they're assessing trees for safety in highly populated areas and high occupancy areas like highways and freeways. So when you take the class, you're going to look for some of the same things, dieback. Once you get beyond smaller twigs into bigger branches, that can be an issue because, a twig like that can ruin a pedestrian's day, a branch like that. And it can also, if that falls in the road, a motorcycle or something could hit that, and it could be show over for whoever that is driving that vehicle, codominant branches, we talked about that as being something that we'll look out for when you're doing planting inspections. And the picture in the middle shows what happens over time when you allow those things to grow as they do. You essentially have two big trees that are pressed up against each other, and their bark forms a barrier. Like these branches have bark that's between those two stems that prevents them from kind of connecting, the wood fibers from connecting. And that's a weakness. Half that tree could split off during a snowstorm or an ice storm if you're up in the panhandle and unlucky, or just hurricanes all over the place. So things to be aware of. And then fruiting bodies. These are this is the flower, if you would say, for a fungus, a wood decay fungus. If you see conchs in a tree, that's a sign that there's wood decay working on the inside, hollowing that thing out. And these are just some really kind of common scenarios that you're looking for when you're inspecting trees. Cavities, a conch is a sign of a decay, but a cavity is very apparent. You can actually measure the extent of the decay when you have this visually. You can put like a ruler in there and figure out how much of the trunk is compromised by decay. The picture to the right of the cavity is a leaning pine tree. And not every lean is a problem, right? But when you have a lean like this, where it's just a completely straight trunk, it's not curving up to the sun where it's not curving, away from the Earth's surface, like, gravity's not kind of riding it. This is a tree with this very straight trunk going sideways, which that just recently fell over or is starting to lean, given root failure. And trees like this, we don't know if they're going to stay up or if they're going to go down on their own, and they need to be dealt with. If you see a tree that's kind of leaning at the base, but then it kind of starts tilting upwards and correcting itself, that's one that, through luck, has kind of made it past the scary point and is self-correcting and is rooting in the ground. But things like this scenario and this second picture to the left are things you need to really be watching for. Root rot. There's a picture, the second to the right, and you can see that when you have root rot, it often shows up as dieback in the canopy because the roots are no longer able to get water to the top of the tree because they're rotten, and not only does it weaken the whole tree and its ability to stay upright in the storm, but the tree isn't provided the water it needs to grow, right? And then finally, we talked about circling roots, and this is what happens when you leave a circling root from a pot in the landscape. This is a big girdling root starting to grow up against the trunk of the tree. And unfortunately, its trunk and root tissues are not compatible. They don't graft together. So this tree is going to actually strangle itself as it grows and the root grows, and they meet more. There's going to be compression on that side of the tree, and it's actually going to girdle itself with its own roots, which is a very sad scenario and a common occurrence in container-grown trees that are not corrected for the formation of circling roots. If they're not upsized fast enough, or if the circling roots aren't cut away, this is what happens. So, assessing palm condition. This is something that, again, FDOT asked us to kind of work on as part of this project. And so the first thing we did is kind of see what was out there. Because if you read Jerry Bond's book, the orange book that I showed you before, where you have ratio, opacity, and all those things, he talks about palms, where he's like, they're different animals, and good luck to you. So we took what he had worked on, and we tried to think of ways that we could adapt it towards the assessment of one of the most common fixtures in your bold landscapings. So we looked at what other people had done in papers, because again, condition and health are things that people often quantify or qualify sometimes when they are trying to compare treatments, fertilizer treatments or planting treatments or whatever in research. So Berchat, he's a common name in this table. He was a horticulturalist who focused on palms in the Fort Lauderdale area, and he had several things that he used in his papers. The appearance and size of fronds, the quality of the canopy as quantified by the frond count. Living frond count was kind of its own term in another paper. The color, is it chlorotic or is it dead? Is it deficient? Duryea looked at the percent of frond loss after a hurricane. Hosek and Roloff, they actually did the most of this in my mind. They looked at the effect of pruning or over pruning based on the shape. And if you over prune a palm, you can actually stress it out. Palms are the neediest thing in your landscape when it comes to nutrition. They need the most fertilizer. They need more than even, at least the non-natives that we use a lot, they need more than turf, right? So, if the thing is, when a palm frond starts to die back and turn brown, it takes a lot of the nutrients that it took from the ground out of that frond and takes it back into the palm and then uses it for the growth of new fronds, right? So if you're over pruning a palm and you cut a lot of green tissue out of a tree, you are going to stress that tree out, both because it can't photosynthesize as much as it wants, and also because you're getting a lot of nutrients, removing them from the tree before it can take it back through natural leaf death and use it for other parts of growth. So if you're over pruning a tree, you're going to have nutrient deficiencies if you don't fertilize to account for that. Hosek and Roloff also looked at discoloration, damage, symmetry of the crown, and fullness of the crown, giving it a 5-point scale. So we looked at all these things, and we use those as inspiration, but we want to stick with the ratio, opacity, vitality, growth, and quality that Bond had, and we kind of put the two together, and we came up with the ratings that you're going to see in a little bit. A little bit of palm health is that they are not like a tree, right? A tree trees grow at all of their branch tips. They grow, their trunks get bigger every year. Palms, they have what we call a root initiation zone, which is kind of a zone of root growth, and everything comes from the main trunk. There's no branching of roots like you see, or not as much branching of roots as you would see in a hardwood tree. The trunk diameter, once the palm starts trunking up, and it's not just like a shrub in the ground or in the grass stage, as we call it, that trunk size is pretty much set. If you over prune, the trunk can get smaller. And some palms get bigger trunks for water storage, but the vast majority of the trunks and palms stay the same diameter. The big thing is most palms, and that is single stem palms, have one growing point, and that is the main meristem at the top of the branch. It's the terminal bud, or the spear leaf comes from the terminal bud. So all that growth is centered on that one area, and as that, there's going to be a different dynamic to the shape of the growth than you would see in another tree like a conifer or a broadleaf. Because of that, we don't have opacity, right? Opacity is, they just don't shed leaves in the same manner as like a tree that has a bunch of little tiny leaflets, right? Vitality, which is the twig dieback, again, we said that earlier, it doesn't apply because they don't have twig ends, and then growth, you don't have the bud scars that you would have on an oak, like we showed you that before. So that left us with ratio and quality as two things that we could try to adapt to measure palm health. So the first thing we did is we looked at ratio. So on a normal palm, they just keep getting taller and taller and taller, and the crown stays pretty much the same size. So your ratio gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the tree gets older and older and older. So if you use the traditional method that Bond showed with that one scale that went from 0 to 100 and you put next to the tree, it would be meaningless for a palm. But what is more useful is this ratio 2 that we developed. So what we did is we took a circle, because if you have a really well fertilized palm and you don't over prune it, it'll start to develop a nearly circular crown with fronds going close to the bottom of the stem, right? That's like your best case scenario. It doesn't always happen, and it varies by species, what we'll show you. So we just figured what we would do is have our circle, and then you put it up to a palm and see how many of those pie pieces are filled by the canopy. Here's an example. So sable palms are a species where you could expect the fronds to get nearly to the bottom and still be green and healthy. So if we hold our, what we do in the field is hold the tool up next to the canopy, but we superimpose it on the picture here. And you can see here that how many pie pieces are filled, like 20%, maybe 30%, and with green canopy. So we would rate that accordingly. And so this one only has, like I said, it has 20% of the circles filled. You'd have a score of 1. And if the tree is dead, you can give it a score of 0. When you do this, you want to try to assess the palms from about the same distance away. And if you can't figure out what the live frond ratio is, you can always put like a 6, because that's beyond the scale, and it's a good way to filter out when you're doing data collection and cleaning later on. So we looked at a lot of trees for our research project, and we kind of got some typical growing arrangements that you'd expect for the palms that you plant the most. And there's other palms out there, but these were 4 that we honed in on for our paper. And it's just showing what, if you have a tree without a crown shaft, like your sable palmettos and your Washingtonian robustas, your Mexican fan palms and your cabbage palms, they tend to have one pattern, and then trees that have a crown shaft, like your royal palms, and others like queen palms. This is like that green kind of sheath that goes right below the the canopy, you have another set of growing patterns, right? And so, like, the goal is you may never, even the best specimen that you have for a given species may never get to 100%, right? And that's fine, because what you're doing is you're comparing these against the norm for the species. So for the Alexander palms, the one in the top left, the normal for this is between 60 and 80%, right? So if you are looking and you see that you're looking at Alexander palms and they're filling it out that way, you're pretty happy, and we'll show you how to rate things that are different, right? So our Mexican fan palms in the lower corner, like, those can get to 80 to 100% full, and it's common, so that's what you're shooting for that species. And what you can do is you can either measure a bunch of palms in your area and see what the normal is if you're not sure, or you can get someone who kind of knows what you should be getting and use their expert opinion to see what is our desired range for this species. Have them look at your planting, like, which one of these looks good to you, and then rate it, and that's kind of your baseline, the one you're shooting for. Palm health ratings, quality. So, again, like before, when we were using quality on our other examples, you want to assess fronds in the upper half of the canopy. So, if it was the hands on the clock and it was a circle over the canopy, you'd be assessing the palms above 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So that the top half, right? And again, you're looking in 20% increments. For this area, you're looking for, out of all the fronds that are present in that area, what percentage of those fronds are free of discoloration and yellowing, right? So in this case, we have a palm which is not doing too well, right? It's obvious to see. We look at the top half of the canopy using the terminal bud, or the point where all the fronds emerge from. It's kind of like our center point. And if you look at the top half, this thing is probably at 20 to 40%, So, yeah. Again, like we said before, when you do data collection, if it's totally dead, just give it a 0. And you stay in the top portion of the crown, because palms will naturally get brown leaves as the older leaves at the bottom of the canopy start to brown up and die, So we don't want to add those in the equations. Just stay at the top, and that'll give you assessment of the health of the tree. And here, like I talked about, you can either kind of get your normal based on what you see for a lot of trees or a lot of palms, or you can use an expert's opinion. But what we would say is, like, if you have whatever's in that normal range, it's call it normal, right? Whatever, if it's 60% ratio or if it's 80%, that's your normal. And anything above that would be excellent health. And if it's 1 rating lower, it's fair. If it's 2 rating lower, it's poor. If it's 3 ratings lower, it's critical. And then dead is just 0, no matter what. So, and with that, we will end this presentation. I thank you very much for your time, and I hope you find this useful. Other people have seemed to be interested in it. So, and we also have a paper that kind of outlines this, available through Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, and that'll be available with this PowerPoint if you want to read that. So, thank you very much.